Welcome to another episode of Scholars by the Sea, a podcast dedicated to exploring recent scholarship in the discipline of history. Our aim is to illuminate some of the great work being done by historians of the United States Naval Academy and beyond, and to share with listeners ideas that are driving new interpretations of the past. With us in the studio today is Dr. Brannon Wheeler, being interviewed by Dr. John Fryman. Dr. Wheeler will be answering questions about his latest book, Animal Sacrifice and Origins of Islam, published by Cambridge University in 2022.
All right. Well, Brannon, thank you for inviting me to do this. Clay, thank you. This is an amazing book, truly. I was telling Clay earlier, it's the most intellectual stimulation I've had in many months. So to get started, why did you write this massively erudite book? There's, many pages of endnotes after each chapter and nearly 100 pages of back matter. So obviously it was thoroughly researched. What brought you to this and kept you going?
The publisher didn't want to publish the bibliography because they said it was too long, but then fortunately, the Naval Academy has a special scholars fund, and they were able to pay the subvention so that the bibliography remained in the printed book, which I think is great. And you're too kind with your words about the book, but it did take me more than 15 years to write. I think I wrote it because it allowed me to do two things. First of all, it allowed me to think about sacrifice in a generic sense. So as a historian of religion, I'm interested in certain concepts that other historians of religion use and how they use them to talk about religion. So sacrifice has always been a big one because it goes back to some of the earliest scholars like William Robertson Smith, but everybody talks about sacrifice.
Right.
So I've always been thinking about it. So the book gave me the opportunity to kind of think about, like, what does that mean that people are the word means to make something sacred, but we don't even know, does it make the animal you're sacrificing sacred? Does it make the person doing the sacrifice sacred? The person for whom the sacrifice is done? The community? All of the above? So that was of interest to me. We know that in the ancient world, people did all sorts they slaughtered animals all over the place. And they did it in what we would think of as like ritualistic or ceremonial fashion. They would bury them in certain poses, or they would have mass graves for animals. And we have no text for what they were doing. So I was really interested in what was that category? What did it mean? And it also gave me the opportunity to think about specifically what Muslims were doing, or what Muslims told us other people were doing when they performed sacrifices.
Right.
And so part of the difficulty with writing it is even using the word sacrifice to translate some of the Arabic words. Does that word mean slaughter? Does it mean sacrifice? What does it mean? So I just went ahead and did it. But there's all sorts of examples that in pre-Islamic stuff, so from archaeology, I had to become kind of a mini specialist in zooarchaeology. As people were burying animals like donkeys and dogs all over the Middle East. I had to learn a little bit about ancient Greece because a lot of burials of horses and chariots and things in Greece.
Right.
And then I had to go to Saudi Arabia, and I had to look at inscriptions and rock art because not all of that's been cataloged or even pictures taken. And I had to learn how to read a bunch of Arabic inscriptions. And then I read a bunch of Arabic Islamic texts that purport to tell us what was happening in the pre-Islamic period. And then on top of that, there's everything that all those sources tell us Muhammad was doing when he did sacrifices. So it was just a huge amount of material. And in the other books that I've written, most of the other books, what I try to do is what I tried to do here, which is to take a generic model and then look at the particulars of the case. And then at the end of the day, evaluate both of those. So does our model of sacrifice help us to understand what was going on in Islam? and the opposite, does the Islamic material develop a more interesting model of sacrifice that we could then apply to Christianity or Hinduism or whatever it was?
Right. Well, speaking of Christianity, that's what drew me in, was just the word sacrifice. I mean, the timing of this interview is fortuitous. I don't think it was just an accident of scheduling, but we're in the middle of Lent, approaching Passover, approaching Easter.
Right.
One of the titles ascribed to Jesus is the Lamb of God. His death and resurrection are around that time, as Christians believe. So the sacrifice, the language of sacrifice, is central to Christianity, and I did not know it was as central as well to Islam. When I was reading this, I was thinking, okay, why the lamb, right? Why is the lamb, and why is the lamb so central? You were talking about, is the animal the interest, the victim, the interest, the focus of interest?
It's not always animals, but hopefully most of the time.
Right, it's not always animals, right? Animate things, I suppose, or right. Well, in this case, if you're looking at Christianity, it's both animal and lamb.
Yeah.
Identified, right?
Right.
As having this centrality, and also that it has effects. So I was spinning that around in my mind the entire time I was reading. Since we're talking about animal sacrifice, that brings me to the camels you mentioned.
Yes.
Why a camel? And you write about the camel as epitome several times.
Yes.
Can you just explain that a little bit? Why the camel, and how are we to understand the camel as central, as epitome in Islam? And later on, I'd like to get to why it's a foundational act.
That's a good question. So let me answer it a couple ways. So the camel as epitome is from just the basic. If you think of Arab, you think of camel. If you see a camel, you think of an Arab, and that connection is not just in modern thought. It goes back to the ancient world. So when we look at the ancient Assyrian records, and the Assyrians had Arab troops in their armies, they would always mention how many camels they brought with them. The Arabs were famous for their use of camels, and people often misunderstand that the camels were used in battle, and they weren't, because camels aren't as fast as horses. But camels can carry your stuff a lot farther than a horse can. So you can load up all your troops on the camels, you can take them somewhere else, and then you can get on the horses to charge the other guy. So camels were in the ancient world, and then the Muslims adopted this, became like the symbol or the totem, if you will, of the Arabs. So you thought of camels, you thought of Arabs. The camel sacrifice is particularly interesting. It's one of the things that fascinated me with this particular case, and it's why it took me so long to write that one chapter about Abraham.
Right.
Because Islam in the Quran is said to be the religion of Abraham, and even without Muhammad, you can still have Islam, right? You can't really have Christianity without Jesus.
No.
But you could have Islam without Muhammad, because it's the religion of Abraham, and Muhammad was just coming to remind people of everything you're supposed to do. So the sacrifice he performs, the famous one with the camels, comes at the end of his Hajj, and it's
which is at the end of his life.
Yeah, right before he dies. He's never done the Hajj before, so people are watching how he does it, because they're thinking, hey, the Quran doesn't say very much about how you do the Hajj, and he's never done it before. So like, hey, we need to pay attention to what he does, at each of these spots, so we know how to do it afterwards. So he does the Hajj, and after the Hajj, he gives this sermon, and there's various accounts of what he says in the sermon, but all of the accounts say that he said something that was culminating. Like he sets up the Islamic calendar, or he says this is the beginning of Islamic civilization, or something like that. And then he does the sacrifice. And to get back to the camel part, you would expect him to be sacrificing a ram because that's what Abraham sacrificed.
Right.
And this whole Hajj is about what Abraham did, right? And Abraham, when he was about to sacrifice his son, was at a mountain nearby Mecca. It's Mount Thabir. And then the Muslim sources tell us, similar to what's in Genesis 22, that God stops Abraham from killing his son, and instead a wild ram is found, and he kills the ram. The Quran then introduces this idea that it was a special sacrifice. And in the Muslim exegesis, there's a great deal made of the fact that this was actually the animal that was created before the world was created. This is in Judaism as well.
The camel was...
No, the ram.
Sorry, the ram.
Yeah,
Okay.
from Abraham. There's a list of things that are created before creation, but in Islam, the ram is created before creation. It's blameless, sinless, if you will, and it turns out to be that it's the same animal that Abel kills when he does the sacrifice. Remember, his brother Cain
Right.
gave produce, and Abel gives a blood animal and then gets killed because of it. So that animal's taken back into heaven, and it's held in heaven for all of that time until it's sent back down for Abraham to sacrifice it. So I'm getting to the camel part, but that does a couple things. One it does is you're not supposed to sacrifice wild animals. So now we've got a domesticated animal coming down from heaven to be sacrificed.
And that victim then is also a product. You said domesticated, but it's coming from heaven.
Yes,
So
and
the
it's
victim
blameless.
itself is provided by
Yes.
heaven,
Yes.
not from the sacrificer. It's
Well,
not,
think about the characteristics of the ram. It's created before anything else. It lives in heaven. It's blameless, and it comes down to save somebody from being sacrificed, to redeem somebody.
that's eerily like the Christian
Yes,
theology.
exactly.
Or the
Exactly.
pre-created word.
That's
comes
not an
down.
accident.
No.
It was intentional. So I'm reading all this, and I'm thinking, well, so why is he sacrificing camels? Why isn't it a ram? Because most of his other sacrifices that we know about, which weren't part of the Hajj, he was sacrificing rams or lambs or goats or something like that. And we don't hardly have any evidence that he did camels. He did bulls and cows, but not camels. I'm thinking to myself, why is it the camel?
Right.
Well, so I spent a lot of time reading about camels. I think I could qualify as an expert on camels. I ended up even reading like brochures from early 20th century camel coat makers, like to find out like what was so good about camel hair that you'd want to have a camel hair coat, for example.
Yeah, you got pretty detailed about the quality of the hair.
Well, you gotta
how
know.
well it's dyed.
Yeah. Which part of the camel do you want to eat? It turns out the hump is the best part because there's a lot of fat in there and a lot of moisture. So I did a lot of research, and I found out that both in pre-Islamic sources, so again like zooarchaeology and inscriptions and classical sources, but also in the Arabic Islamic sources that come from hundreds of years later, but they purport to tell us what was going on in pre-Islamic Arabia. And they all tell us that camels are a substitute for a human life. So if, for example, in Islamic law, if you were a man and you wanted to marry a woman, you would have to pay a bride price, and the set amount is 100 camels. Now it can vary depending upon your rank and her rank. If you were to kill somebody, they would say you have to give 100 camels to their family. And then there's even the hypothetical case that if you vow to sacrifice your son or somebody else, you have to redeem it by giving 100 camels. So I said, okay, so this is kind of classical sacrifice theory. One of the big explanations of how sacrifice worked is through substitution.
Right.
So the camels are substituting for the Prophet Muhammad's body.
And that unit of that 100.
That 100,
of
it had to be
camels.
100. And so the Islamic sources, just to make sure we all understood that, in addition said, well, he didn't just pass out the camel, he also passed out actual pieces of his body after he performed the sacrifice.
Right, the hair and the
The
nails.
hair. Yeah, well, there weren't a lot of nails, but there were a lot of hair. And so he passed out apparently everybody got at least one hair. And you know, it's a pretty clear, what should I say, a pretty clear idea what's going on there. Is there any other famous figure who was a prophet who near the end of his life had a big meal with a bunch of people, and then passed out pieces of his body to them, and founded a movement that came after him. So, and the thing about Islam that's so fascinating is they've got like a 500-year advantage on Judaism and Christianity, because they get to read all the things that the Jews and the Christians were saying about the Bible.
And they saw it.
And they're like, oh, this is good. We're going to use this.
Right. They saw it practiced, I'm sure.
Of course.
So two things occurred to me as you were talking. One was, how does that centrality of the camel translate to other cultures, peoples in Islam, since it's a universal proselytizing religion? But I don't think of the camel as being central to the next great center of Islam in Persia.
Yeah, or Indonesia.
Or Indonesia.
Yeah.
How does that work? I mean, and I know that the Quran is only in Arabic. So the text goes to the other cultures, but how does that, the camel, the language of the camel, the centrality of the camel translate into the other cultures?
I don't think it does.
Okay.
So if we were to read Islamic law about what you do when you go on the Hajj and why you might have to perform a sacrifice, not everybody has to do it. You only have to do it if you perform some sort of mistake.
Right.
That requires a blood sacrifice.
Right.
And there's also two special cases. So if you want to perform the Umrah, which is just around Mecca, and then you want to afterwards do a Hajj, like put the two together, and whether you desacralize between them or not, there's like one's a Quran and one's a Tamatu. You have to do a blood sacrifice. But today, it's much simpler. So if you were to go on Hajj today and you'd say, "Oh, I want to do a blood sacrifice," or "I have to," you basically just buy a voucher. You go up to the ticket window and you're like, "I need a lamb." You pay your $800 or whatever it is, and they give you a little ticket. And then at the end of the Hajj, you just turn in the ticket and somebody does this sacrifice for you. And Islamic law is very clear that a lamb or a goat, right, that's the basic sacrifice. Now, if you want to go in with a couple other people, then you go to a cow, because a cow's like 5 to 7 people. And if you got a camel, then that's like 12 people.
Wow.
So
this is big business.
Yeah, the size of the animal. Well, I mean, remember, this is a central part of the New Testament too, right? Jesus goes to the temple, and it's like, no more sacrifices. Get these animals out of here.
Right. He condemns the trading right there, because he sees it as profaning the area of the temple, the sacred area.
It keeps them from carrying the blood out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's fascinating. And which I probably should add, when you asked about Christianity and Judaism, most people don't think of sacrifice being central to Islam, animal sacrifice. But it is, with some minor exceptions, but it is really the only biblical religion that still does animal sacrifice.
Oh, yes.
Because Jews and Christians don't do it anymore.
Literally animal sacrifice.
Yeah.
If it's in Christianity, it's by means of symbol.
Right.
And then depending on the branch of Christianity, whether it's a new sacrifice or a reenactment of sacrifice, or a bringing into the present a sacrifice that has never ended, right? That is somehow outside of time.
And that's why the lamb is so important, because it's that symbolic value of the lamb.
Right.
Yeah.
So in it, bringing in the other monotheisms, the Abrahamic ones, the other question I had in mind related to Abraham was, well, Abraham was commanded to sacrifice his son.
A son, yes.
But was Muhammad commanded to sacrifice? Like, why did he do it? Was it in response to a divine command, to a revelation? Because, as you mentioned, it's not in the Quran. I noticed, by the way, how it's extremely seldom that the word Allah appears in here. Quran appears more often, because it's Allah talking. Is how I took that. Yeah. But why? What moved him to do that?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer. I do not recall reading anywhere that God told him to perform the camel sacrifice. What I gathered from the text was that he was doing this in imitation of Abraham.
Okay.
Which is why the ram and camel thing was so interesting to me. Why do the camels? The other thing about the camels that's so fascinating is that in a lot of Indo-European traditions, we have a primal being that sacrifices itself to create the world, right? In the Rig Veda.
Right, like the Purusha hymn.
Yeah, all of that. So the primal being just sacrifices itself and creates the world out of it. And in the ancient Near East, I was telling my students, the king's not going to sacrifice himself. He's going to kill somebody else and use that person's body to create the world. With the camels, you get both, because not only are the camels a substitute for Muhammad's body, so he's giving his own, but they're also a symbol of what he's captured from the enemy. Those camels are his trophies that he's taken from somebody.
Right.
In fact, in many of the stories, a number of them, like 70 of them, were brought at the last minute by Ali, his son-in-law, who had just gone to Yemen and destroyed a temple and melted the idol down and brought the camels back so Muhammad could sacrifice them. So it's melding together that both that ancient Near Eastern tradition of combat plus the self-sacrifice.
Following on all this, the sacrifice, why Muhammad did this and all, I was very much struck by this next piece about this sacrifice being foundational, and I quote, "This camel sacrifice marks the end of the Prophet Muhammad's mission and the origins of the Islamic civilization that is built upon and succeeds that mission." You know, after having taught HH 215,
Right.
pre-modern world, right? I had always been teaching midshipmen that Islam begins with the revelations, or if you like, that the dating, if you want to go with calendars, starts with the Hijrah.
Right.
This was brand new to me. I'd never read this anywhere else. First of all, how is that taken to be foundational? And do Muslims see it foundational, or just scholars of religion, or just the jurists? Where does that really belong in Islamic time regarding origins?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a good opportunity for me to say that I'm not really a historian. I'm a historian of religion,
Sure.
which, as you know, means that I use some history, but I also use a lot of cultural anthropology and archaeology and other things. But it also means many historians are interested in what really happened, and I'm not. I'm interested in what people say happened and why they say it that way. So I'm particularly interested in why are the Muslim scholars telling us that Islam begins with this camel sacrifice.
Okay.
Because from a Western point of view, we might think Islam begins with Muhammad and getting revelations or the Quran. And so a lot of that has been, it's actually been absorbed into the Muslim community today. So many Muslims look at Islam through this Western reconstruction of how it originated, this chronological idea. What I'm looking at is more akin to the mythology. So what was the myth that Muslim scholars were creating? And I don't mean myth like it's false.
Right.
But the
Right.
story that they were creating to talk about how Islam began. And that's why all that stuff is so important then, the links with Jesus and the links with Abraham, because those all become the acts themselves. It doesn't really matter whether they happened. It's the symbolism of the act.
Right. As you point out, these myths are cosmogonic, or as you
Or maybe
were coining
sociogonic,
or
right?
sociogonic, right, as you coined the term.
Which is the cool thing about the Muslim sacrifice. So Muslim sacrifice is revisionist, meaning they're aware of what other people did before them. They're particularly aware of biblical sacrifice. They're also aware that Christians and Jews don't do it anymore, and they're like, well, we're still doing this. We still got the real thing going. But it's revisionist because if you think about biblical sacrifice, only a small part of the animal is consumed. The rest of it's burned.
Right.
And so the Greeks had the same thing, right? Except they were smart enough to figure out that we'll burn the bad parts and we'll eat the good parts. the Muslims don't waste any of the animal. The entire thing is used as food or providing people shelter or clothing. And it can be the ritual itself of consuming the meat can be years away, because every year when I think there's 1 million sheep, or 3 million sheep maybe, that are shipped to Mecca to be sacrificed, and they can't eat all of that. So they freeze it, and then they ship it to poor countries, and then maybe 2 or 3 years later somebody eats it.
It's amazing.
But the Muslim sacrifice is truly sociogonic. It's the entire thing is dedicated to the society.
And so
God doesn't get any.
Right. So he doesn't get any, and so that's where is that the origin thing? This is what founds the society. So in what they tell themselves, is this where the Ummah begins and not with the Hijrah?
I think I would have to write another book to answer that question, because one of the things I've noticed is that not a lot of people are aware of the story the same way you said. And I was not either until 20 years ago when I started writing this book. I came across it because I'd written an earlier book called Mecca and Eden, and I was interested in the notion of territory and how it is that Muslims used what we would call like material culture to talk about, not literally, but through material and rituals and things, to talk about their myth and their worldview. So I looked at the way that like the relics of Muhammad were distributed. I looked at the way that mosques were built and where they were built. And so one of the things that kind of stuck in the back of my mind was I had read this thing about these camels being sacrificed. So when I first started the book, it was more like, oh, this is kind of like a footnote. And then it turned out to be like 3 or 4 times longer than the other book. And I kept asking myself when I was working on it, am I saying what I've already said before? And do I need to write something about and I realized that maybe this was the book I really wanted to write originally, but it took like 15 years to actually.
That's a good portion of your life.
Yeah, and most of it was, all of it was here at the Naval Academy. I was working on it when I got here, and I published it when I got here. So the Naval Academy is truly a producer of that book.
I'm glad it was able to facilitate the research.
Yeah, and I've come to think of research. I don't like to call it research anymore. I like to call it preparing for class, because I don't think you can teach without doing research. And in order for me to teach effectively, I have to do research. So I'm really preparing for class. And I can say honestly that everything I've written has been the result of some student asking me in class a question and then thinking, well, wait a minute. I don't know if I can answer that. And then, 15 years later, what's going on here? So hopefully, I don't think I have enough energy in me to write another book to answer the question you asked. But it's strange that it has not, how should I put this? The Muslim scholars were not entirely successful in promulgating that myth of origins of Islam. For some reason, and I think it has to do with colonialism, I think it has to do with Western scholarship on Islam, that the if you will, kind of the indigenous Muslim story of how things began, the myth they attempted to tell, got displaced. And maybe it was because of that it was too close to Christianity, and they wanted to separate themselves from that. I mean, if you think of the way people talk about Islam, it's always how it's different from Christianity and it's different from Judaism. And people don't often talk about Islam as, well, these are all things that Abraham practiced.
Right, as an Abrahamic monotheism.
I mean, they kind of know, Abraham's in there somewhere, but we're not really sure how.
Right. And again, the Abraham is, as you said, his role or how he's portrayed is revisionist.
Yeah, he gets Arabicized and desertified. Maybe that's the wrong word, but he turns into like a desert culture hero.
Sure.
In the Islamic sources.
Sure.
And it makes perfect sense, because if you read the biblical account, he doesn't really have a personality in Genesis. He kind of, God tells him to do things and he does them. And then sometimes he asks God and God says, listen to your wife, do what she tells you. the Muslims kind of draw on that, and they skillfully place him in a slightly more southern location,
Right.
and they turn him into an Arab culture hero.
But which you also see Christianity doing in different parts of the world, how Jesus
Well, Abraham
is,
becomes the first Christian, right, for the Apostle Paul.
Right, absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
like, how'd that happen? He was way long before. That's okay. We can
Well,
still
the first believer for sure.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
The first Jew, if you
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
I what as I was reading, and thinking about sacrifice, I had always just been thinking of sacrifice, at least within the Christian context, as having to do with sin and
Yes.
expiation,
Yes.
which I did not see in here, but which is still clearly central to Muslim practice.
Yes.
It's just a comment. It
No,
just
you're
broadened my way of viewing sacrifice. Because even then I thought, wow, what is this being done for? What is he expiating? What is what is the sin to be atoned
Right,
for?
right.
Right. And I didn't see any of that other than a violation of the ritual precincts of the sacralized body
Right,
and
right.
so on.
It reminds me of a question a student asked me just the other day. We were reading Leviticus, and a student said, so if the Jews aren't performing animal sacrifice anymore, how do they get their sins forgiven?
Right.
And I'm like, okay, that's a really good question. So for
Right.
the Muslims, you don't need to get your sins forgiven. You might make a ritual mistake for which you have to perform an animal sacrifice, but you don't need to do that to still be a Muslim, right? To still get into heaven or whatever it is you're trying to do. It's not seen as in the Levitical, which later was, as you know, reinterpreted in Christianity as being necessary, right? If you don't have, the Christians said, if you don't have the sacrifice, then you have to be killed because you're not killing something else in your place. And so then, therefore, we need this combination of the goat and in Leviticus 16 and the Paschal lamb from the Passover, right? Jesus' sacrifice has to combine those two things, so we don't have to do that anymore.
Right. You don't have to do it anymore, but you still have to observe
Of
it.
course. You have to
and
believe that it's happening.
That's right, and you have to participate in it
Right.
somehow.
Right.
Because it's his command.
Right.
Right. You will do this in memory of me.
Exactly.
Now Christians have been arguing about that, I don't know, for at least 1,500 years.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change the fact that it's seen as having to be done because he commanded it.
Right. Right.
The other thing that really struck me too, and this was a challenging chapter, was was bringing in martyrdom
Okay.
to sacrifice,
Yeah.
right? And how you brought it into the present, about how this is really relevant, how your book is relevant to understanding the phenomenon of Islamic martyrdom, at least as people claim it within Islam.
Right.
I know this is a dispute even within Islam,
Of course.
but just for the audience, could you just summarize what the main points are about how this idea of sacrifice, animal sacrifice, is tied to martyrdom, which I think is not quite the same sort of martyrdom that you have in other contexts. You're giving up your life for another.
Mm-hmm.
This seemed to be a little bit more expansive, actually. So how, maybe we take a concrete case. How does a Muslim who martyrs himself see what he is doing?
Yeah.
And how is that a faithful imitation of what Muhammad is doing in his sacrifice?
Yes. Excellent question. So we were talking a little bit about is the camel sacrifice seen as the origins of Islam, and even people who know that he does the final Hajj, because it's pretty well known as his farewell Hajj. It's the only Hajj.
The only Hajj, right?
But it's the farewell Hajj. It's called that in Arabic, and people know that he did that and all that stuff. But they don't really think a lot about the camel sacrifice. And part of that could be, I know I'm getting off a little bit off your question, but part of it could be that there's an implicit proto-Shi'i claim in the sacrifice, because he shares the meal specifically with his son-in-law Ali, who's then claimed to be the first imam after that.
Right.
So that might be one of the reasons why it went away. But the way I interpreted the martyrs was that they were imitating the part of the sacrifice where Muhammad gives up his own body for the community. So they're not sacrificing an animal, they're not sacrificing camels, none of that stuff. But they're imitating his foundational act of creating a community with their body. And in effect, they do that by going into enemy territory and creating an outpost. Right? So I tried to make the argument, and a lot of this is based on so in college, my junior year, I spent a year at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I did some independent studies with some scholars there. And one of the guys was a guy named Michael Lecker. And later I ran into him at a conference in Japan, and I'm still in touch with him. He's a great guy. I think he's emeritus now. And he'd written this great paper. The conference was on territory in Islam or something. And he wrote this great paper about how all of the martyrs wanted to be carried into enemy territory. And I couldn't ever get that out of my mind. And when I was writing this book, it just occurred to me why they were doing it, because they wanted to do what Muhammad had done by creating the community, and they needed to do that outside of the Dar al-Islam, if you will, in enemy territory. So there's story after story where somebody would be sick or they're on a battle and they're like, let me just get as far into Roman territory or whatever as I can, and then I will permanently deposit my body there. And so the best way of permanently depositing your body is just like to break it into thousands of pieces, right? If you could literally, which happens today, explode your body, then your body is permanently part of the land.
Right.
You can't get rid of that. In fact, it's kind of gruesome, but you can find images where these acts of martyrdom occur, for example, in Israel, and then the main issue is the Israelis have to come in and they have to find all the body parts. And they have to figure out and try to collect them and move them to another location.
A lot harder to do if one blows oneself up
Yeah.
instead of going in with a rifle or whatever.
Yeah, if you
and
just
then
get a
is
gunshot
shot.
and you fall down,
Right.
they can take your body away.
Right, right.
But there's a lot of early Muslim stories where the land would hide the body. Like the ground would open up, or like wasps would come by and they would like cover the body so no one could see it. So it would be absorbed into the land. And then birds would come by and they would eat the fruit of that the land had produced with that body, like a fertilizer, and then they would spread it even further.
So it's a way of advancing or expanding the Dar al-Islam
Yeah.
before there's even Muslim rule.
Exactly.
That was another way to expand what I was learning about Islam, because I'd always thought that the Dar al-Islam is where the law, the Islamic law, reigns.
Yeah.
Right, but this is before even that.
Because it
Symbolically,
hasn't
anyway,
gotten there
as you
yet.
point out,
Yeah.
symbolically, anyway. Right, so I thought that where there's no law, it's the Dar al-Harb. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
but,
Yeah.
I guess this is probably providing a toehold for the expansion.
A famous example or infamous example is 9/11, right? These Muslim martyrs permanently deposited their bodies at Ground Zero, and that became a big debate when they were thinking of putting a museum there and a memorial, because people were saying, well, what about, like, if we put a memorial there, aren't we memorializing the Muslims' bodies as well, that they're in this location? So that became, I think they eventually decided that wasn't going to be an issue. But in fact, that it just now occurred to me that when I first came to the Naval Academy and they were interviewing me to decide whether they wanted to hire me, somebody asked, I talked about this kind of a topic because I was thinking about it, and somebody asked exactly that question, like, isn't this what was going on? So maybe that's the truth then. The reason that I wrote that chapter in the book was because somebody asked me in the talk I gave at the Naval Academy before I was hired about that question, and it was stuck in the back of my mind. And so thank you for reminding me. It's one of
Sure.
those synchronicities, right, where you suddenly realize, wow, that's why I did that.
I find that the questions that really animate me, I've had for decades,
Yeah.
right? That there are certain things that obsess me, where at a point where I'm not even aware, right? They're just always simmering back there,
Yeah.
and it shapes how I think or look into things.
Well, we're scholars. We're constantly working. Wake up at 2 a.m. and you're like, "Where's that piece of paper? I just got a thought. I got to write it down."
Yeah, I wish I were that self-disciplined. Can we go back to the bombers, because
Yeah.
the other part of it is, if their martyrdom is seen as a form of sacrifice in imitation of Muhammad's sacrifice, then what about the victims? How are the passengers seen from the standpoint of the men who crashed the planes into the buildings and into the Pentagon and into the earth in Pennsylvania? How do they see them? Because in no other context could they be seen as legitimate military targets, for example.
To answer that is very complicated, in part because the people who carried out 9/11, the people on the airplanes, had a very distinct, maybe even unique form of Islam that they were practicing. And they tell us there were letters discovered after the event. One of them was in a suitcase in a car at Dulles Airport. Another one was found in the wreckage of the flight that crashed in Pennsylvania. And people have tried to reconstruct those letters. We don't have the whole thing.
Okay.
There's also a mysterious first page that was lost and some other stuff. So it's kind of complicated. But in there, there's places where they say you need to take a drink of water because you're taking like booty from the enemy by taking their water or something. And there's things in there about slitting the throats of the people.
Yeah, that was a little disturbing.
Right, because you don't want to, because that's how you sacrifice an animal. You don't just, burn an animal alive or bludgeon it to death. You have to slit its throat. So there does seem to be a kind of awareness on their part that there was a link between that and sacrifice. But there's a lot of writing about martyrdom in Islam. Some of it's very legally oriented about who counts, and some of it is more mythological. And I think what I was more interested in was that the concept that you would be establishing an outpost of Islam in enemy territory. The most famous case is the Sidi Sahib, when Constantinople was first being sieged and the guy was going to die. He's like, take my body as far into enemy territory as possible. And then later, when the Turks are taking the city from the Romans, the tide turns when they find his tomb. That was what turned the tide. As soon as they found his tomb, they're like, okay, this is it. And then they kicked the Romans out.
The Romans being the Byzantines.
Yeah, the Byzantines.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I'm calling them by what they want to be called.
Exactly. That's how they referred to themselves.
Right.
I just wanted to bring that out
Yeah,
in
right.
this conversation.
The late Romans.
But still Roman.
Exactly.
Second Rome.
Exactly.
Well, I think to bring things
We're
together.
at like 45 minutes already.
Are we?
Okay,
Okay. So can I ask one last one
Yeah,
to wrap
all
it up? So, since this is so clearly a lifelong fascination of yours, what are you doing next? How is it connected to your current preparation for teaching instead of research?
Yeah. So I've become fascinated by the idea that, of course, when we teach, we want people to learn how to read carefully, to construct arguments, to be able to analyze texts. But I think there's another skill that's particularly of value to naval officers, and it's the ability to not to think outside the box, but the ability to think without a box. Like, how do you solve problems that you've never thought of before.
That is well said. Yeah.
What are you going to do? Because there's a lot of procedures you're going to learn on the ship or in your school or whatever, but you're going to encounter something that you've never been trained for.
Most of the things that hit me were not in the book.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that through personal experience. I've been on a carrier twice through the RCEP program, and I was a little bit surprised when there was a fire in the tower and they couldn't find it. I thought, okay, now this is interesting. So one of the things I've done in recent years is I've started teaching classes where there's no clear answer to the questions that I'm asking, and it's not clear that anybody's really even sure, like what would an answer be. And I tell my students it's like keeping all the balls in the air at the same time. Can you do that? So one of the things I'm working on, I did a class last year on history of UFOs, which was fascinating. The students loved it, and I loved it. And then I started realizing that there was very little serious social science research on the phenomena, as people call it. I found like 6 or 8 books, and we used them for the class. I also discovered that there's a huge amount of area to cover, that you can't contain it in a single class or a single study. So as I kept digging, because I've been researching, this Islamic legal stuff for so long, I found something a little bit new. I thought I'm really interested in this. I started digging in it, and I realized that I'm interested in, I have been for 30 plus years, how it is that non-human intelligences, like God, angels, whatever it might be,
Octopuses.
How do they communicate with people?
Mm-hmm.
How does that happen? And I realize I've written many books about prophets and scripture, and read the texts about the scholars talking about, well, what language did God use when he was talking to Moses or Muhammad, and how did we get the text that we got, and then trying to figure out what the text says, right? How do we apply it? And I realized that there is a whole untouched field of subject matter experts around today who are firsthand experiencers of non-human intelligence. You could actually, if you could interview Muhammad and say, what was it like? So I can actually talk to people and say, hey, what language does this being speak to you in? People in contact with angels and demons and all sorts of stuff. So specifically about sacrifice, you may have heard that, probably because I mentioned it beforehand, that there's this thing called cattle mutilations. It was really big in the 70s, although it still happens today. And these are, ranchers would find that one of their animals had been surgically dissected, be missing certain body parts, and significantly that it was placed in a ceremonial fashion, and nobody knew how this was
I
happening.
think this is in an X-Files episode.
I'm sure
too.
everything
Yeah.
everything in the X-Files is from real life somewhere. There's also an Unsolved Mysteries, like the recent, I think it's in the last season that's on Netflix now. There's one on cattle mutilation. But I was talking with a guy named Colm Kelleher, who, along with George Knapp, had investigated the cattle mutilations for like 10 years. And they were working for a guy named Bigelow in Las Vegas, who was a billionaire, and they had their own private jet. So they would fly to all the places where the cattle mutilations were occurring. And as he started telling me about the animals, I realized that this was so similar to sacrifice. That it's not just since the 1970s that animals have been ceremoniously cut up. It's been going on since the dawn of time. I met an ancient zooarchaeologist in Finland during spring break, and he's telling me about all the animals that people killed and arranged ceremoniously. So I don't know the connection, but there clearly is one. And I think it's, the gods are constantly demanding, non-human intelligence is constantly demanding that we give them animals.
In animals, would you also include humans? Because we know that humans are also mutilated by certain kinds of killers.
Yes. I don't know. I have not gone down that road yet with my thought.
Probably a dark road.
Well, but there's a whole set of theories within the study of religion about human sacrifice. And I actually like William Robertson Smith's idea there. He says, and the case that I use in the book, that human sacrifice is only used when you don't have an animal. right? It's not like animals substituted because we didn't want to kill humans. He was saying, no, the animals are more expensive than the humans are. We can get a human pretty easy, but it took us a long time to raise this animal. So if we don't really want to give up our animal, we don't have a good one, then we'll just use a human. And the pre-Islamic Arabs, they would go and they would raid Christian villages and bring the Christian boys
victims,
back and
right.
sacrifice them to Uzza.
Right. Okay, well, I think I hear the midshipmen marching.
parade.
So
Ominous drum beating.
Yeah.
Human sacrifice in the back. I feel like it's symbolic.
I don't know if that's a good way to end, but there you go.
it's a way to end.
All right.
I wish we had longer.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thank
Thanks,
you
Joe.
very much, Brannon.
Thanks
Thanks
for reading
so
the
much
book.
for what you do
One
here.
of the 5 people who read it, maybe.
I don't care who the other 4 are. I find
Yeah,
it
exactly.
absolutely fascinating. So thanks again.
Yeah, well, thank you.
This has been a production of the History Department at the U.S. Naval Academy, located in Annapolis, Maryland. If you enjoy our programs, please let us know, as we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can reach us on Twitter and Instagram at USNA History, and our email is historyproductions-group@usna.edu. For more information about the History Department at the Naval Academy, please visit usna.edu/history.